Warning, this video contains spoilers for the following visual novels: Cartagra, Kara no Shoujo 1, Kara no Shoujo the second episode, and Ama no Shoujo or Kara no Shoujo the last episode. If there's even one of these you have not read yet but still want to, I highly recommend leaving the video now. If you've read them all or don't care about spoilers, let's dive in. Innocent Grace's mystery visual novels have become one of my all-time favorite series. While I've enjoyed other mystery visual novels, a lot of them have mediocre endings. But what sets Cartagra and Kara no Shoujo apart is their thematic consistency and execution. Each game has its own standalone mystery that works independently but also ties into the others just enough to feel unique yet connected. Finding that balance in visual novels is rare, and it's even rare for every entry in a series to be good to some degree. That said, while I do quite like the series, it's not without flaws. In this video, I'm going to break down what I like and don't like in detail while analyzing the story and characters. Right off the bat, one thing the whole series nails is its mature atmosphere. While there's some humor, mostly snarky comments or the occasional goofy joke, it avoids the typical boring high school harem tropey humor. Even the weaker entries stick to this tone, helped by the setting, most which take place in winter. There's just something about snowy winters that meshes perfectly with murder mysteries. Speaking of, the core mysteries themselves in each game are another big win. They're well built, and the reveals of the culprits are timed and paced almost perfectly. The only real downside is that the mid-game villains tend to be less interesting and fleshed out compared to the final ones, but with such a large cast among 4 games, there's only so much you can do. As someone who isn't into super grotesque, edgy visual novels, so you won't catch me touching clock-up visual novels like Euphoria, Maggot Baits, or Dead Days, I think Cartagra and Kara no Shoujo strike a good balance with their darker elements. The gory deaths are detailed enough to show how messed up the killers are, but the actual killings are only described through text. You get a sense of how horrifying things are without being overwhelmed by overly graphic visuals and unnecessary edginess. It's just the right amount of unsettling for me. The series' strongest point, though, is the ability to nail bittersweet Utsuge-like drama. A lot of mystery visual novels either force happy endings or go so vague with their bittersweet conclusions that it's hard to care, which can ruin the story in hindsight. But Cartagra and Kara no Shoujo never have that problem. Every ending stuck the landing for me, balancing resolution with enough tragedy to remind you that not everyone can be saved. It's a hard truth to swallow, but the way it's handled is masterful. That said, my biggest issue with the series is the terrible use of H scenes. While this improves as the series progresses, the first couple games specifically are notorious for horribly placed sex scenes right before bad endings or in random tone-breaking moments. H scenes in visual novels are hit or miss as is, and while I'm generally fine with them, even I found their placement in this Cartagra plus Kara no Shoujo series baffling. I would say the overall character cast is a mixed bag as well. Most aren't bad, and there's always at least a handful of good ones in each episode, but very few come close to being my all-time favorite visual novel characters, and there's actually a few who rank among my unfortunately least favorites, mainly the whole Takashiro family. I do appreciate that the main games star adult male protagonists, but they're inconsistent in how likable they are. That said, they're still a lot better than your typical boring romance harem visual novel leads. In short, the series has a lot of characters, some likable, some not, and a few I actively dislike. Now let's get into my specific thoughts on each visual novel, starting with Cartagra, the original Innocent Grey visual novel. This one is complicated for me. In some ways, it does things better than the entire Kara no Shoujo series, but in others, it easily has some of the worst aspects of any Innocent Grey visual novel I've read. I'll start with the positives. Cartagra helped establish the tone for the Kara no Shoujo series, especially with its excellent winter setting. The intro, featuring a woman's death, immediately sets up an atmosphere of mystery and uncertainty, complemented by the music. One thing Cartagra does better than its next entry is its larger focus on adult characters. While Kara no Shoujo 1 includes some adult age characters, it also has an uncomfortable number of high schoolers the protagonist can get close to, sometimes to the point of having sex with them. For all its faults, which I'll get into later, I'll give Cartagra credit for keeping its main cast mostly within an adult age range. It's also the shortest Innocent Grey mystery visual novel, around 20 hours if you go for the normal or true ending. Unlike the Kara no Shoujo games, it lacks a gameplay investigation system, making it arguably the best paced entry in that regard. You only have to deal with standard visual novel choices without the more frustrating gameplay mechanics, such as pixel-perfect investigations and map selection screen segments. Diving deeper, I actually thought the twist involving Arashima, Shugo's former boss and an inspector at the Ueno Police Department, being the true villain was pretty clever. While it could have used a bit more build-up, having the mentor figure turn out to be the culprit was a solid twist that isn't too common in mystery stories, I think. On the character quality side, Toji is easily a standout. A badass one-armed woman who handles tough physical work, protects you, and still has wife-like tendencies? Hard to beat. As long as you don't mind a woman who smokes and is missing an arm, she could very well be the ideal waifu of the Innocent Grey mystery series. She's so likable, they consistently brought her back as a cool secondary investigator in Karo no Shoujo 2 and 3. I also generally liked the tragic backstory of the Kozuki family. Obviously, the dad is a monster for allowing his older daughter to be sold for brain experimentation, but the overall tragedy is well done. You can at least understand why people acted the way they did in that whole thing. Yura is clearly conflicted and jealous of Shugo's relationship with her sister Kazuna. The fact that your ending determines whether Shugo ends up with Kazuna or Yura, though obviously Kazuna is clearly the true heroine, is a nice touch. Unfortunately, that's where my praise ends because Cartagra has a lot of issues that drag the experience down for me. While it's technically well-paced, that's only if you skip the sex scenes. Since Shugo's home base is a brothel, it's not surprising that a lot of thirsty women want to sleep with him. But what is surprising is that he never has to pay. He's just treated like an irresistible sex god that they throw themselves at for free. It would make more sense if Shugo had to pay for their services, but instead they act like they're just doing it for fun in their spare time. Worse, this unsolicited nonsense extends beyond the brothel. Toji literally offers herself to Shugo just because he's feeling sad after an argument with Kazuna in the normal ending. The only sex scene that has any actual proper buildup is the one with Kazuna in the true ending, since it actually has emotional weight. Speaking of Shugo, aka Cartagra's protagonist, I have a lot of issues with him. He feels more like a passive Moige-style protagonist just going along for the ride rather than an actual detective. He's supposed to be a war veteran and skilled investigator, but aside from a few moments, he mostly lets others do the work for him. His detective skills boil down to escorting girls, hiding family secrets, and looking at lists of names. The one time he seems remotely confident is when he distracts Akao so Toji can do the actual work of saving Kazuna. The fact that this is one of the only times he's voiced in the original non-HD version at least, just makes him seem more capable than he actually is. Honestly, Shugo is just a mediocre, disappointing protagonist. What makes this worse is that his detective work gets solved for him by his little sister Nana no less, who might be one of the worst visual novel heroines of all time. She's a high schooler, yet somehow solves every single mystery in the game. She figures out the first culprit just by hanging out with them, then spoon feeds Shugo the answers through some dumb quiz. She does this for every major mystery afterward, including one of the biggest endgame twists, that Yura was alive the whole time and planned to impersonate Kazuna to be with Shugo again. Why is Nana hoarding all this information instead of helping the investigation actively? Why is she solving everything when it should be Shugo's job? And why is she such a pretentious, obnoxious know-it-all about it? No one even calls her out on this. To top it all off, she makes weird, incestuous, teasing comments about being willing to sleep with her own brother. Nana alone drags Cartagra down significantly for me. If she were removed from the plot, the game would at least be a little bit more consistently enjoyable. There are plenty of other problems too. The midpoint villain Fukamizu Kaoru, aka the Nun, barely has any screen time, so her villain reveal has no emotional impact. Akao and Arashima fare a bit better, but they still needed more build-up. The brothel women's introductions felt like forced attempts to make you care about them emotionally before they're killed off. Outside of maybe one or two, their deaths didn't really hit at all. They were just another statistic in this game. Overall, while Cartagra has great atmosphere, good pacing, and a few likable characters, most of the cast is either boring or outright unlikable, especially Shugo and Nana. The villains aren't as built up as well as they should be, and the sex scenes are completely unnecessary, especially the ones that aren't even tied to side routes or bad endings. The game feels like a Nuki that just happened to stumble into a half-decent mystery story. Because of all this, I just consider Cartagra just okay at best. In my opinion, it's very skippable if you just want to get the much better executed Karo no Shoujo series. The few cool cameos and references to Cartagra in later KNS games might not be worth 20-ish hours of potential headaches. Before diving into the Karo no Shoujo series, I want to quickly touch on Cartagra's supporting releases. The first being Nagomibako Innocent Grey Fandisk. While this technically includes content from PP Pianissimo, my main focus is the Cartagra side story featuring Yura. However, since this route isn't really canon, I didn't particularly care enough to fully read it. That said, if you're dying for more Cartagra content, especially around some of the final plot twists of the original story, it might be worth reading. Just keep in mind this is fan-translated only. Finally, there's the currently untranslated as of this video Cartagra Full HD version. Given that the original Cartagra came out in 2005 and this version was released nearly 20 years later, the jump in quality is significant. Updates include modernized character designs, Shugo getting full voice acting, and even new H scenes. These are neat improvements, and I hope Shirobune eventually translates this version. However, I probably won't reread it, since the fundamental issues I have with the story would still remain. Now diving into the Cartagra Shoujo series, I'll be using The Shell Part 1 Inferno version of the game by Shirobune, as I've never played Manga Gamer's original release. Speaking of which, one of the most significant improvements in the HD version specifically is Reiji's full voice acting. His chill, snarky yet caring personality truly shines with it, making the experience far more immersive. I honestly could not imagine Cartagra Shoujo without Reiji's voice acting, alongside other features from the original version like outdated 800x600 resolution. Having said that, I consider Cartagra Shoujo 1 a significant upgrade over Cartagra. A major reason for this is Reiji, who is a massive improvement over Shugo. He's consistently likable, more competent, and actively solves mysteries rather than relying on others. While I don't think he's quite the god-tier protagonist some people make him out to be, he's undeniably solid. Sadly, just being a likable and voiced male protagonist in an eroge visual novel is rare, which is probably why it gets a bit overhyped. Because Reiji is a more capable protagonist, I found myself much more engaged in solving the mysteries. Structurally, the game is similar to Cartagra with two main killers, the first half revolving around Reiji uncovering that a school teacher is brutally murdering girls at a high school where he teaches. The second half of the story is far more complex, involving Shinji Mamiya, his famous novels, and his deeply disturbing family history. What's particularly compelling about the second half is the strong buildup that leaves you questioning key details. Reiji not only solves these mysteries, but also helps resolve lingering emotional issues with Shinzo Mamiya, aka the person who made the painting with the token title name drop Cartagra Shoujo, which was a nice touch. The mystery of Reiji's long-dead fiancé being connected to psychiatrist Tamaki Saito was also well executed and felt more personal than anything from Shugo's past in Cartagra. To summarize, the major mysteries in Cartagra Shoujo are, in my opinion, significantly more engaging than anything in Cartagra. The supporting cast in Cartagra Shoujo 1 is generally much more likable and memorable than Cartagra's, which suffered from forgettable or outright unlikable characters. Right off the bat, Yukari, Reiji's younger sister, is a vast improvement over Nana. Unlike Nana, who's an obnoxious know-it-all who somehow solves everything that an adult detective should, Yukari is a more believable younger sister, taking on household responsibilities after their parents' deaths. And thankfully, despite the Cartagra Shoujo series' unfortunate tendency towards incestuous themes, there's zero sexual tension between Reiji and Yukari. Outside of a dumb early fanservice scene in KNS 1, incest between these two is mercifully avoided, which is a miracle given how common incest pandering is in Japanese media. The more general adult age cast is also a highlight. Reiji's closest friends, Uozumi, a police detective, and Kyoko, a coffee shop owner, are great additions, providing a refreshing contrast to the darker aspects of the story. The main high school staff, like the reasonable vice principal Saeki, and the Kuchiki hospital staff, including Fumiya and Koharu, add further depth. There are also some fun cameos from Cartagra, with Reiji briefly teaming up with Shugo and Kazuna. Though Shugo remains as lame as ever, though at least this time, the new writer of Cartagra Shoujo actually acknowledges that Shugo is pathetic rather than pretending he's some genius detective. KNS 1 also introduces a pseudo dating sim mechanic where you can select locations on a map of Tokyo to interact with different characters. While a bit hit or miss in execution, it generally works well if you want to know where certain characters tend to be. Personally, I thought Kyoko was the best girl in this game, so I prioritized spending time with her here. It certainly helps that her pseudo-romance route in this game is basically canon for Cartagra Shoujo 2 and 3. Despite being around 10 hours longer than Cartagra, I still found the pacing still surprisingly decent. The slow build-up allows the characters to develop before the main mysteries take center stage. Once the series events unfold, the tone shifts effectively, making for an emotionally gripping experience. While I do like Cartagra Shoujo 1 a lot, there are several major flaws that prevent me from loving it as much as I feel like I could. I get that eroge VNs and Japanese anime and weeb stuff in general have a weird obsession with high school girls, but their inclusion here just felt often awkward and uncomfortable. Reiji's interactions with many of them felt awkward, especially with how Reiji got weirdly flirty with them. Most of the high schoolers themselves didn't really stand out or are outright annoying. The only exception to me was Ayumu, the tomboyish bro character who was genuinely chill and helpful. Now here's a spicy Ange tier hot take. I'm not a huge fan of the main heroine Toko Kuchiki. While her backstory, particularly her search for her biological origins, was interesting, her teasing, whimsical personality just felt like it was pandering to a certain masochist reader demographic at times. Worse, she's the only character you must have sex with to unlock the true ending, which I found unnecessary and forced. I never really bought into her supposed romantic chemistry with Reiji, which made her later storylines in KNS 2 and 3 fall flat for me. While Kara no Shoujo has fewer H scenes than Cartagra, they're just as poorly handled. At least in Cartagra, Shuko primarily slept with consenting adult women, even if some were dangerously close to high school age. Here, Reiji seemingly has no issue sleeping with anyone of Japan's original legal age of consent, which, reminder, was still 13 in the 1950s when the story was set. This results in some deeply uncomfortable sex scenes, particularly involving the high school aged heroines. While many are optional, some, like Toko's, are required, and others, like with Natsume Takashiro, my second least favorite character in the whole series, are forced on you no matter what. These scenes were handled terribly and felt completely unnecessary. While I appreciate the idea of playing detective, the gameplay execution of it is clunky. The investigation mechanics are like a janky, low-budget version of Phoenix Wright, overly specific, cumbersome, and often requiring a guide to get the best endings or just not get bad endings. In so many cases, you need to visit the right locations in exactly the right order to avoid a bad ending, and we're not just talking about 1 or 2 choices. You sometimes need to visit 4 or 5 places in sequence. The worst part? Certain investigations can slightly alter the ending, which feels needlessly convoluted. Many of the side endings could have been streamlined into the true ending to reduce the padding. Despite these flaws though, Kara no Shoujo 1 to me is a huge step up from Cartagra. The mysteries are far more compelling, the cast is more likable, and Reiji is significantly better protagonist than Shugo. However, its handling of high school girls, uncomfortable H scenes, and clunky investigation mechanics hold it back from being one of my all-time favorites. Thankfully, Kara no Shoujo 2 fixes many of these issues, so let's dive into that next. While I've seen some hardcore KNS 1 fans disagree, I think Kara no Shoujo 2 is generally rated higher by people who have read the whole series. Honestly, I agree. This is a perfect example of a sequel that improves on almost everything from the original while still preserving its original strengths. The cast is even better than before for me. We still have the favorites like the still competent Reiji, the likable Yukari, with thankfully still no unnecessary incestual sexual tension, the wholesome Kyoko return, alongside plenty of new interesting characters. The flashbacks do a great job of introducing these new characters, and those who make it to the present connect well to Reiji and the crew. More importantly, the ensemble cast feels more consistently important and properly used. In KNS 1, half the high school girls who ended up being killed by either of the main villains felt like they barely matter or get enough screen time for me to care when they actually die. We don't even see much of the final villain, Shinji Mamiya. His acts are mostly conveyed through narration and other characters talking about him. KNS 2 at least gives us enough time for the characters that actually matter, including ones unfortunate enough to die. As far as the title heroine for KNS 2 goes, I actually personally prefer Yukiko over Toko. Yukiko's socially anxious, shy personality makes her more relatable to me compared to Toko's whimsical and often annoying teasing. Yukiko may not always be the most compelling character, but she's easier to sympathize with for me. Another standout is Toji coming back from Cartagra, an important character with great banter alongside Reiji. Even less likable characters like Natsume, the coroner, and the obnoxious officer Yaginuma feel more tolerable here. They're still flawed, but not to the point of being obnoxiously frustrating like in the earlier games. The actual mystery is tougher to compare. The relatively straightforward yet deeply messed up family drama in KNS 1 was very different from the complex, multi-generational conspiracy of KNS 2. Both are strong in their own ways, but KNS 2 is definitely much more intricate. While it might be easier to identify the culprits halfway through, the game does a great job of fleshing out their backstories and motivations, delivering satisfying reveals along the way. I also appreciated the inclusion of the Blessed Congregation and its neat ties to Senri from Cartagra. While understanding the references to the Shigasa family and how Senri influenced the Blessed Congregation adds depth, KNS 2 still stands strong on its own without Cartagra. You do not need prior knowledge of Senri's involvement to grasp the complexities, it's just a cool throwback for fans. KNS 2 structures its mystery perfectly, and, at least to me, is a better version of Umineko, another murder mystery centered around one big fucked up family. In my opinion, Umineko tried too hard to mislead players with unnecessary distractions, like wasting time on the idea that magic was legitimately a possible explanation for the murders. One area where KNS 2 clearly improves on is the gameplay and choice system. It's still not perfect, but feels much more streamlined compared to KNS 1. Most investigations are relatively straightforward, requiring players to explore everything before moving on to the next scene. There are only a couple of instances where specific choices are needed, like finding Yukiko on the map to avoid a bad ending. That aspect annoyed me on a first playthrough, but it's a minor issue. Despite how much I enjoy this game though, a few flaws prevent it from being a 10 out of 10 experience for me. For instance, KNS 1 ended with a cliffhanger about Toko, Shinji Mamiya, and their disappearance. While KNS 2 explores how this impacted Reiji and Yukari, the actual resolution for Toko's fate is saved for the very end of the true route. By the time Reiji finds Toko and Shinji's bodies, it just feels like an afterthought. I already didn't care that much about Toko's relationship with Reiji, so this moment didn't land emotionally for me much. The pacing is definitely a step down compared to Cartagra and KNS 1. At 45 plus hours, this visual novel is the longest in the series, with a particularly lengthy flashback that, while interesting, interrupts the flow of the main plot. Forcing players to go through the normal ending before unlocking the true route didn't help either. The layered mystery is both a strength and a weakness. While I loved piecing together the intricate storylines, the balance between the mysteries sometimes felt off. Characters like Yukiko and Kohane had fascinating twists, e.g. their involvement as test subjects, but their screen time was limited, making their big reveals feel a little bit underdeveloped. Similarly, the killers' motivations were a bit too simple compared to the complexity of the overarching plot. Karen's actions boil down to incestuous jealousy, making her an obvious culprit early on. Other killers like Nanako had more relatable motives, but the overall leniency towards their repercussions just felt unsatisfying. Speaking of discomfort, this game leads heavily into incest themes, which might be off-putting to some. While these themes fit the old-school family traditions explored in the story, especially around Shizuru, aka the ultimate fuckboy, they can be unsettling, especially when paired with other mature content like the age gap relationships from KNS 1. That said, despite its flaws, Carno Shoujo 2, the second episode, to me is a significant improvement over KNS 1. Its intricate mystery, improved cast, and resolution of plots from Cartagra and KNS 1 makes it an engrossing and satisfying experience. There's so much more I can mention, like Michiru's quirky personality tying characters together, or the subplot with Tamaki Saito, which is explored further in KNS 3, but I'll just leave that at that. Overall, Carno Shoujo 2 is an excellent sequel, one I know many love for good reason. But before we get into KNS 3, I'm going to do a not deep dive into the series I'm about to mention. This will just be a brief note to highlight a gap in the release schedule of Carno Shoujo in Japan. If you look at the original release dates, KNS 2 came out in 2013 in Japan, while KNS 3 did not arrive until late 2020, basically 2021. I vividly recall when KNS 3 was in limbo. Delays and doubts left many wondering if it would ever release. Fans were eager to see the thrilling conclusion after the cliffhanger of Reiji finally finding Toko's dead body, and curious about what would happen with Naori running off with their child. So what caused this nearly decade-long gap? The writer Suzuka Miya took a break from crafting twisted murder mysteries set in the wintertime, instead going on to assist Innocent Gray with development and writing for a Yuri all-ages girls love visual novel Flowers, a visual novel series with 4 VNs, each representing the 4 seasons, and each entry running about 15 hours long. I haven't gotten far in Flowers myself, I only read like a few hours of the first game ages ago, but it's intriguing to see how Carno Shoujo influenced some characters. For instance, Suo, the main heroine of the first and fourth games, seems clearly inspired by Yukiko from Carno Shoujo 2, sharing traits like extreme social anxiety and shyness. Once again, I won't delve too much into the Flowers series since I haven't fully read it, and this isn't a retrospective on that series or Innocent Gray as a whole. Still, giving the KNS writer a breather to eventually go full force on the KNS series' gripping finale, it's neat to see how the Flowers' art style influenced Carno Shoujo 3 and gave time for the cinematic scenes to be in that game to be at their absolute best. After finishing Carno Shoujo the last episode, or as Shirvune localized it, The Shell 3 Paradiso, I have to say my personal opinion is that it's quite good, but it had some untapped potential. From what I've seen, fan reception has been kinda mixed. Some say it's the perfect ending, and on sites like Edo Gamescape, aka the Japanese VNDB, it's the highest rated Innocent Gray game ever. However, plenty of people call it the most disappointing entry in the series, with something that it was clearly rushed. Personally, I'm kinda in the middle of both viewpoints. I don't think the story it was trying to tell matches the emotional core of Toko Kuchiki's story from KNS 1 or the incredibly well-detailed, methodically crafted Hirogata mystery of KNS 2, but still good for what it is. The best way to analyze Carno Shoujo 3 is through its unique structure, how it's divided into 2 parts, everything revolving around Sei Maizano pre-timeskip and the post-timeskip mystery about the underground trapped kids with a seemingly copycat murder the first half's case. I'd say in theory, splitting the game with a timeskip was a pretty solid idea. It gave the first half time to develop its own mystery, which would later become important in the second half, especially with how the pre-timeskip arc ends, with Tamaki Saito going missing and the writer having to find a way to make him the final villain of the series, which is pretty fitting for Reiji's character, considering Saito was essentially the catalyst for the entire Kara no Shoujo series with his whole thing about crucifying pregnant, unmarried women. Obviously, he was messed up for killing people, but at least he had some motivation behind just being evil for the sake of it. It was nice to see certain relationships that started in the first half of KNS 3 or even previous games become more relevant in the post-timeskip half. The game clearly aimed to tie together as many loose ends as possible while still having something of a standalone story in the first half. In fact, what I'd say Kara no Shoujo 3 does best as a whole is emphasizing emotional catharsis through tying up these loose ends. Beyond Tamaki Saito as the final villain, Reiji finally gets closure by finding his lost daughter who went missing at the end of KNS 2. There's even a scene that mimics one of his most notable moments with Toko Kuchiki, using this exact same line about finding her true self. I know a lot of Toko fans who thought this was the perfect way to end the series, and I'd say Innocent Grey did a great job with the true ending. While some things could have handled a little bit more gracefully, like bringing back Uozumi as the main police detective ally to replace Yaginuma, ended up being a fun idea, especially since he finally gets to simp for his long-term crush Kyoko and actually ends up with the waifu he's always wanted. Speaking of Yaginuma, this guy has had quite the journey. He started off as the biggest asshole in the entire series for no reason in Cartagra, then slowly became more humanized in the KNS series, and now, in KNS 3, has an actual legitimate character flaw to develop. His obsession with his older sister in a coma, which I forgot was brought back up all the way back in KNS 1, so it was nice for it to be brought back 2 games later. His really messed up past and his quest for revenge against Rokushiki makes his role in the second half of the game feel pretty meaningful. Whether he dies or not, his presence ties everything together pretty well. That said, he was pretty stupid for falling for Rokushiki's offer so easily. Masaki's arc was more low-key compared to everything else going on, but I really liked where he ended up by the end of KNS 3. After all the Hirogata trauma from KNS 2, it was surprising that the accident was actually brought up early on when he gets his psychiatric help from Kaede. While he still has things to work through, he's a lot less depressed, gets his own apartment, and plays a more direct role in investigations. Even Reiji acknowledges when he does good work now. Honestly, I got more emotional in the Masaki ending than the true ending because I cared more about the Hirogata conflict than anything related to the Toko Kuchiki family drama. I still think it's dumb that Masaki doesn't know Michiru is his own daughter though. On a minor character level, Ayumu Sato finally got to be assistant to the sensei she always admired since KNS 1, which was honestly kinda cute to watch, and Reiji and Kyoko finally called off their toxic, codependent, friends with benefits relationship to heal properly, which was nice, much needed development. While they aren't the most compelling antagonists in terms of making you hate them or creating deep mysteries, I did find the trio of Chie, Sei Maizono, and Sasakura pretty interesting from an emotional perspective. Their tragedy, connection to Sei's sister, and how Sei turned to murder for art was a bit over the top, but at least it made sense for how weird she was. And well, both Sasakura and Chie's romantic feelings for Sei were clearly what set everything off in the first half. On a gameplay level, thankfully, KNS 3 is probably the least annoying in the whole series. Gone are the days of KNS 1 and 2 where you had to grind defection points to unlock the true ending. Now the slice of life choices are purely optional and you can pick whoever you want. Interestingly, they're all from Masaki's perspective instead of Reiji's, which only makes me appreciate Masaki as a good co-protagonist even more. There are still a few choices where observing or missing certain evidence leads to different endings, but thankfully the investigation sections are as linear as KNS 2. If you're just aiming for the grand and true ending, things are by far the least frustrating to get, with most key choices revolving around keeping Yaginuma alive, deciding whether to kill Tamaki Saito immediately, and avoiding pretty obvious bad endings. In general, the H scenes in KNS 3 are handled by far the best of the entire series. Cartagra, KNS 1, and KNS 2 had a lot of blatant Coomer pandering scenes that just broke the pacing of an otherwise serious and grounded story. KNS 3 still has sex scenes, but they're much shorter and way less fanservice-y. They feel more like R-rated movie slideshows with cinematic narration that actually ties into the story instead of just being hentai bait. I'm sure the Gooners were disappointed, but as someone who never cared for the way Innocent Grey handled H-scenes, I'm really glad they took this approach to make the final chapter just feel more serious overall. Now, as much praise as I'm giving KNS 3, it does have a few unfortunate huge flaws that make it not quite as great as KNS 2 to me. While I think the mysteries are kind of interesting from an emotional standpoint, however, by making the villains not quite as reprehensible as Cartagra, KNS 1 and 2, it ended up making the mysteries not as interesting to figure out. Don't get me wrong, there's still some decent plot twists and such, but things clearly aren't nearly as intricate as KNS2's. In fact, while I thought the fact that the killer of the second half was a psychopathic little kid was at least unique and interesting, the whole thing of having to keep her in an underground basement was just a little too silly for me. Speaking of which, the time skip in general just feels a lot more rushed than it should be. The first half of KNS3 had just the right amount of pacing and build up with its mystery and building up all the characters' emotional stuff leading up to the second half of the story. However, in the second half, there's just a lot of things clearly the writer wanted to build up more but just didn't have the time or chance to. The first was all the romantic tension, starting off with Yukari and Masaki, who have been teased as a couple ever since the middle of KNS2, and honestly, I just don't see it. Age gap thing aside, which I'm not into, the only thing these two have in common is the fact that Yukari saved Masaki from dying, which was nice in KNS2, but the only romantic tension I see between the two before this time skip was just the characters attempting to tease them all the time, but Masaki and Yukari were pretty quick to deny them as just being friends. Then suddenly this time skip happens and Yukari is suddenly getting feelings for Masaki out of nowhere? I don't know, I don't get it. They don't even really get together by the end, so their romantic scenes just feel like a waste of time. Reiji and Stella becoming a couple, I really love in theory since they have some fun interactions in KNS1 and the first half of KNS3. I like the idea of Reiji finally finding someone else who's a little bit healthier for him than relying on Kyoko. The problem? We're just not given an explanation or at least kinda lengthy flashback on how Reiji and Stella got together. Just Reiji giving a comment on how they just kinda met together by chance during the time skip, and Stella making some comments about how she's cool being a replacement for Toko, which is kinda weird, but whatever. At the very least, Stella upped her wholesomeness when she got in this pseudo relationship with Reiji, which I liked a lot, and it's such a shame their relationship did not get built up better. But the grand couple, aka Kyoko and Uozumi, is the biggest disappointment for me because, in theory, this is the one I want to support the most, considering Uozumi's been simping for Kyoko since KNS1, and he's clearly a much healthier option for Kyoko than Reiji, since they were just using each other for dealing with the fact that their previous loved ones passed away. However, I thought KNS3 did not, in my opinion, do so good a job at giving Uozumi and Kyoko the proper chemistry in their interactions to justify the fact that they do eventually get into their grand marriage by the end of the game. They certainly tried hard to, though, by having all these bar scenes, which were nice to have, but despite how cinematic they were, I don't feel like they really made me buy into this couple that, in theory, should be great, but these scenes just ended up being a lot of pussyfooting dialogue. I get that there's a lot going on in KNS3 already, but maybe this is just the issue of writing out Uozumi for all of Kara no Shoujo 2. Finally, despite KNS3's focus on emotional closure for many characters, which I'd say for the most part works well, sadly, who gets closure and what is definitely not made equal. While Iroha grows up to look like her mom and is even able to quote her about finding her true self and all that, the Masaki ending, despite me really liking it in theory, not only, in my opinion, should not have been separated from the grand and true ending, but to me was just overall pretty disappointing. This is the only time in KNS3 we get to see Yu Futami and Naori in the flesh and actually talk. Despite the nostalgia of being able to see these two again, overall I feel like this scene didn't really have any actual closure besides Masaki just being able to talk to them one last time. We only really confirmed that Naori is probably going to commit Sudoku and Yu is just not even important anymore. But even in the grand ending, where it's nice to see some characters again that we haven't seen in a while, there's still some weird exclusions. How come Yukiko gets her emotional ending with Yukari, but Kohane just doesn't appear at all in KNS3? Wasn't Kohane part of one of the biggest twists of the experimentation on kids thing from KNS2 and one of the close friends of Yukari and Yukiko? How come the characters still have not told Masaki that Michiru is the daughter of him and Fuyumi? These just feel like weird things to leave on the table, even though they were kind of important for character closure. Then again, I guess these characters in this series don't like to talk about things since Reiji purposely did not tell his daughter about all the tragedies involving her mom, Toko, but I consider that more understandable since Reiji not wanting to involve his blood-related daughter in the complicated serial murders makes sense, while leaving out telling Masaki that Michiru is his daughter doesn't really have any meaning besides just an extra joke at Masaki's expense. Finally, while I liked the idea of using Rokushiki as the final villain in the series with an interesting final confrontation, I found that there was a weird lack of tension of him even showing up, especially since he apparently didn't really do that much, if anything, during the time skip. Similarly, the inclusion of Fumiya and Chizuru as minor antagonists was interesting, but ultimately they were just accomplices and not much else. there was a really awkward revelation where apparently even Fumiya got an obsession over the long-dead Toko, to where Rokushiki walked in on him getting off to Toko, which was very, very strange to say the least. I guess it was nice to include him in a serious part of the plot in the series, but I don't know, I didn't buy the buildup of his importance, and it doesn't help he's just not even referenced to that much in the time skip. That said, even with all my critiques, I still quite liked Karo no Shoujo 3, the last episode. It wasn't as long or built up as it should have been, but I think the pacing, streamlined gameplay, and removal of annoying segments made it the best paced story in the series. The mysteries, while maybe not the most complex, were definitely still engaging, and some of the emotional beats hit pretty well. Sure, there was a bunch of missed potential, but I think some people are being a bit too harsh on KNS 3, expecting it to be some god-tier masterpiece after KNS 1 and 2. Maybe it could have been, but honestly, the fact that the KNS series ended on a very solid ending is still way better compared to how many mystery visual novels I've read that ended up having unsatisfying or overly convoluted conclusions. Now that I've covered each game individually, I want to take a broader look at the themes that pervade the whole series. If I really wanted to, I could probably be here all day going over all the little things and themes tied to each specific character and entry. But for this section, I'm just going to focus on 3 major themes that I think are important across all 4 main visual novels in the series. The first and most obvious one to me is obsession and how it can drive a person mad. While KNS 3 hits you over the head with this theme the most, the other 3 games certainly have their fair share of it, even outside of the main villains. Yura and Kazuna Kozuki's oddly mutual obsession with each other is a prime example, though Kazuna's is a lot healthier. Still, considering she's the main reason the entire plot gets set into motion and eventually resolved, her insistence on finding a supposedly dead girl shows how obsession can push people to extremes. Reiji's obsession with hunting down the killer of his ex-fiancée and later the high school girl he impregnated, Toko Kuchiki, drives much of the plot. Karo no Shoujo 2 takes a more straightforward approach with Karen's obsession with her brother leading her down a dark path. The elders of the Hirogata village family are so obsessed with preserving their religion that they resort to horrifying acts, and even the police officer Inui is desperate to solve the decades-long mystery of Hirogata's supposed curse. In KNS 3, Yaginuma's relationship with his older sister, while tragic, feels like it was dug up from an optional KNS 1 dialogue just to make him more sympathetic. Fumiya randomly being obsessed with Toko in KNS 3 long after her death also seemed to be a last-minute addition that fueled the second half of the story. You could even make a funny argument that Uozumi's devotion to Kyoko is a more positive take on obsession, given that his dedication eventually led to their marriage. These characters alone show how obsession can change a person's motivations for better or worse. The psychological breakdowns that come with it are some of the most compelling parts of the series. The next major theme revolves around the villains and how nearly every single major antagonist has a legitimate and interesting reason for becoming one. I'd say the only real exception might be the crazy nun from Cartagra's first murder case, but after that, every villain has at least some depth to their motivations. From Arashima's frustrations with past events to Shinji Mamiya's incredibly screwed up backstory, and even Rokushiki lashing out due to his infertility issues, the series rarely gives us villains who are evil just for the sake of being evil and getting an emotional reaction. As someone who enjoys shonen-style storytelling since I was a kid, I've noticed a common flaw with that genre. Villains often fall into one of 2 extremes. Either they're too cartoonishly evil to the point that it's hard to take them seriously, or they're made arguably too sympathetic that fans start saying that the villain was right, which is usually not the author's intent. Cartagra and Karo no Shoujo strike a good balance, keeping them just human enough to empathize with them while never shying away from the fact that they're still doing horrible things. Take Yura Kozuki in Cartagra, for example. There's no doubt she had a messed up past and that her family was to blame, but that does not excuse her own equally twisted actions. The game allows us to empathize with her while still making it clear that she's an antagonist who should not be out in public. Similarly, the Hirogata family clan in KNS 2 is as messed up as it is because of strict traditions that push people to committing horrific acts. When Reiji confronts the village elders in the later part of the game, they may be frustrating to deal with, but they genuinely believe in their warped ideals despite knowing the truth about their family's sins. Even in Karo no Shoujo 3, the so-called antagonists of the first arc are some of the most sympathetic yet. Sei may have killed people for artistic curiosity, but there's no denying her talent. Sasakura, despite seeming to legitimately love Sei Maizono, still participated in illegal copycat paintings and pressure Sei to continue doing them. And Chie, while clearly devoted to Sei in a wholesome way, murders Sasakura on an emotional whim based on a false assumption. This moment perfectly captures how a single emotionally driven mistake by a low-key crazy person can lead to devastating consequences. Even the Naruto family, as insane as they are for keeping their killer daughter hidden and kidnapping other girls to be her friends, ultimately they were just prioritizing their daughter's happiness above all else. Their actions were definitely horrifying, but their motives, at least from a very warped parental perspective, made sense. Finally, the last major theme I want to talk about is identity, arguably the most important one in the series. Many major characters struggle with who they are and what defines them. Back in Cartagra, Yura Kozuki had to pretend to be someone else multiple times, even impersonating Kazuna in the true ending in an attempt to win Shugo's favor. In KNS1, one of the biggest plot points leading to the true ending is Toko Kuchiki's search for her true self, which in her abstract way of speaking means discovering her real heritage after struggling with the fact that she was adopted. KNS2 takes this even further, with major flashback characters Ayato and Ayako using multiple names throughout their lives, Ayako especially, who was also known as Satsuki at one point, and eventually Fuyumi. Yukiko and Kohane's storylines also revolve around regaining their lost identities, with their self-discoveries playing a key role in the endgame drama. KNS3 doesn't focus on this theme as much, but there are still a few key moments, like Sei Maizono faking her death by using her deceased sister's body, and of course, her entire character arc stemming from said sister's shoulder defect that resembles wings, which played a major role in shaping how others perceived her, and eventually her unfortunate suicide. Finally, Maristella in the time skip of KNS3 fully embraces her identity as Toko Kuchiki's replacement in Reiji's heart, and doesn't mind playing that part as a pseudo-girlfriend, since they're both looking for mutual healing after previous trauma. And then there's the true ending where Iroha, being Toko's daughter and an extreme lookalike, repeats the exact same phrasing about wanting to find her true self. After Reiji initially chose not to reveal he was her blood father to try to keep her away from the insane connection of murders and messed up stuff related to Iroha's mom, Toko. This ended up being a pretty long analysis video, but for a series like Kara no Shoujo and I guess Cartagra, it's 100% deserved. It's one of the few visual novel series with full-length stories for each entry, featuring standalone murder mysteries while still continuing character development from previous games. It somehow found a good balance of having a murder mystery series where you can make choices to determine endings while the main protagonists still have their own personality. Sure, there are flaws along the way, like Cartagra having an incredibly disappointing Takashiro family, KNS1 having way too many choices and H scenes, KNS2 being way too slow-paced at times, and KNS3 being the total opposite, rushing developments and trying to do too much at once. But the fact that a 15-year running series was able to conclude as well as it did, honestly being better than a lot of long-running video games, anime, TV shows, and especially visual novel endings. Many fail at delivering a satisfying conclusion, but the Kara no Shoujo series somehow pulled it off. For that, I'm grateful that Innocent Grey was able to craft something so well, both a murder mystery that's genuinely satisfying to figure out, and an emotional story with strong character development that ties deeply into the setting and the murders themselves. I'm also glad that the combined efforts of Manga Gamer and Shirobune allowed the series to be fully available to read in English.